Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
Hello, Karen.
Hey, Dan.
And we are still in the wet, abnormally warm January, to be honest with you.
Right? 60 degrees. Woo!
Wet.
It's so January.
It's not wet and cold, but it's not wet and warm either.
But don't worry, it's going to snow, right? So,
yeah, it started. This winter started with a roar. I mean, it came in like a lion, and it just, I don't know, got hit by a car or something.
I'm just so worried that we're going to have a really cold snap and then it's going to get really warm for like 2 weeks and it's going to confuse all our fruit trees again. And I am just terrified that is going to be how our future goes, because that is significantly going to impact our fruit production. Was it 2 years ago? We had that 70 degrees for 2 weeks in February, and all the trees were like, oh, hey, it's time to start blooming. And then we got, 2 months of cold after that, and there was no fruit that year,
Isn't that how the story goes with peaches in Ohio every year?
Well, with peaches, yeah. Peaches are not really acclimated to as cold as it gets up here. They bloom too early. There are some later blooming varieties that are better for this area, but you definitely need to get a late blooming variety, and then you also need to plant it on a north slope so that it gets the sun the least amount. So that way it'll bloom later.
Yeah. So the stuff you're talking about, it just getting a little too comfortable and then breaking the bud too early.
Yeah. And peaches are notorious for that. Another early bloomer is blueberries, and they'll start blooming really early, and they can tolerate some cold, but not like it happened though, like not when we're getting sub-zero temperatures and whatnot. They can't handle that. I'm talking about after they've bloomed, right? Because there's this critical temperature zone whenever fruiting plants are flowering, that if it drops below certain temperatures, it creates damage to the bud itself and prevents the plant from being able to fruit. And so when that happens, then you don't get fruit. And so frost damage is a danger, and it's something to be concerned about.
But you know what else likes blueberries?
What's that?
Birds like blueberries, don't they?
Oh, yeah. They eat mine every single year. I love robins. I think they're beautiful and wonderful birds, but I hate robins because they eat my blueberries every single year.
Yeah. Well, in this show, we always talk about planning ahead. We always talk about thinking about what you have to do months before you have to do it. And then things tend to go smoothly. And if they don't, they tend to go better than if you had no plan at all.
This is true.
For people that say things never go as planned, things go better when you do have a plan, even if they don't go as planned.
This is true.
That's my experience anyway.
If you don't plan, then you're planning for failure, right?
See, that's another way to put it. Yeah, all kinds of wisdom.
That's what we're here for.
So let's start planning for the spring. And we're going to talk about a pest that's not always a pest, that some people like, some people hate, can cause damages in a variety of ways. We're talking about birds.
Right.
There are birds that are protected, and there are birds that are straight up and invasive, and they're not protected. So birds run the whole gambit. They can be a very big nuisance in both agriculture or whether we're just talking urban environments. And, some people really like them, but depending on the situation that you're in, they can become a nuisance and it can cause damage.
Right, and feeding birds is one of the suburban and rural American pastimes that you buy bird food, you put it out in a bird feeder, and you have some pretty little animals that you get to watch all winter long. The problem with feeding birds is you don't always get the birds that you want at your feeder. Sometimes you get birds you don't want that then come and cause problems in your home. And some of those would be your sparrows, maybe your house sparrows. Pigeons can be a nuisance as well. And starlings are my most
Favorite.
despised bird. I have an issue with starlings.
Yeah, Darren spent a long time talking about her hatred of starlings. Yes. But considered a nuisance by the USDA.
This is true. Yeah. And so, for those of you who aren't familiar with identifying bird species, house sparrows are very small. They're only 5 to 6.5 inches long. They weigh less than an ounce. They are light brown. They have streaks of gray. They may have a little throat bib, at least the males will. And, so they look very, very small and they go cheep, cheep. But
right.
they will make a nest anywhere that they can, and a lot of times they will go into your attic and they can make a real mess, and they like to put their nests on porches, and once they've started building a nest, it's really hard to deal with that they keep coming back and they want to put it in the same place every year. And they lay a lot of eggs. So females can lay 3 to 9 eggs up to 5 times a year starting in early April. And so once they've started that nest building on your porch, you're in for the long haul. So that's one of the reasons why house sparrows are a nuisance. And I won't talk about starlings because I'll go off on tangents. I'll let Dan cover those.
Yeah. So starlings, they are robin-sized, short-tailed blackbirds, about 8 inches long. Their plumage color changes with gender. The females have less color, just like a lot of birds. And from November to April, the beak of the starlings change from brown to lighter shades. But I want to say, they're just a darker bird, not quite as big as a crow. But they have a lot of they like barns, and they will basically just kind of take over. They prefer to actually make the nest in cavities, which makes it a lot harder to get to. And then obviously they're flying around in there. All these birds can spread to certain diseases, and bird poop is actually uric acid. So birds, kind of being similar to reptiles, at least genetically, they have a water preserving mechanism where instead, like, they excrete nitrogen through uric acid. That's why when people fertilize with chicken litter, it acidifies, because you're basically putting in uric acid, but it's a very concentrated nitrogen source. So it's good fertilizer. But once you have starlings in the barn and you have equipment in there and they're just kind of taking over the place and making a mess of things, they can also, that acid can start eating away at equipment, causing rust, making things dirty, attracting other insects, and they can have lice. And then if you bring your animals in there, you can see where this is going. It just, it kind of, it can invite a lot of problems. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and pigeons, well, pretty much everyone knows what pigeons are. They are one of the most ubiquitous birds, especially in urban and suburban areas. And, they're fairly large gray birds, about a foot long. They weigh about 12 ounces, typically gray with black bands on wings and one black band on the tail. They will have 6 to 10 broods a year. And they raise their young during spring and summer when temperatures are above freezing. They usually nest on a sheltered ledge. and females will lay 1 to 2 eggs per clutch. So when you're looking at the potential of 10 broods and the potential of 2 eggs per clutch, that's 20 new pigeons a year. They are different than mourning doves. They are rounder and fatter, and mourning doves are native, so they don't cause as much of an issue as pigeons. Now, with all these species, they all eat grains, but they do have different dietary needs. So your pigeons, they need water and grit. But sparrows eat fruit, so they're going to be more of a pest when it comes to fruit growers. They also will eat fat, and starlings and sparrows both eat insects, which is kind of nice, especially when they're raising, they're nesting. They need that extra protein source. And so we're always thankful for any bird that eats insects, but these can be a little bit more of a pest.
That's right. And I guess one example of how pigeons can cause damage in the urban environment is, their excrement. One example that I have here is in gas station canopies can clog downspouts, leading to collapses during a rainfall. We say that for gas stations, but that can happen in your shed. That can happen anywhere. They can start clogging things up. And a lot of these birds also will take over nesting areas for native birds. Some will actually destroy eggs from the native birds, even fight with them and keep them away. So they can really take over an area in not only a damaging property way, but also they can keep native birds out and kind of reduce the ability of the native species maintaining their presence in an area.
Right. And bluebirds are specifically really hard hit by these invasive birds. And, we've seen a significant decline in our bluebird populations. And so, protecting bird nesting sites for bluebirds, putting up post nesting sites for them can help, but you have to protect them from these other birds and keep them out of their nests. And these birds can also carry diseases. Salmonella can be carried by pretty much any bird, but also different parasites. They can transfer Newcastle disease, cryptococcus. There's a lot of things that they can spread around. So, that's why you don't pet wild birds or pick up dead ones with your bare hands. Yeah. Always wash your hands after you touch them.
All the kind of stuff you don't want your food to come in contact with. So, a lot of these barns and sheds and things like that are kind of processing facilities, and you harvest and you put it there. And if you have a bird problem, now you're basically putting the fruit and vegetables into a potentially dirty environment, and you don't want that.
Right. And one of the things, like when you have birds roosting in your attic, one of the problems they can cause is the mites that live on the birds can actually travel down through your house and bite you when you're sleeping. And sometimes you think you have bed bugs, but it's actually bird mites or bat mites that are causing these mysterious bites to appear on your body. And so if you are having that problem and you don't have bed bugs, check your attic and see if birds have been roosting in your attic. That may be contributing.
Or bats.
Yeah. Bat mites too.
And that's a different category.
Yeah, that's another issue. But a lot of the exclusion techniques you would use for birds would work for bats as well.
Yes.
Especially when you're looking at the physical exclusions where you are blocking off any openings that are going up into your attic, making sure that you're putting mesh screens over any exhaust vents, and do make sure that if you're putting a screen over your dryer vent, let it have a slightly larger grid to it so that the dust doesn't collect on it so frequently, and always make sure you clean your dryer vents to prevent fire hazards.
But I will say this, just as a caution, if you're trying to exclude bats, bird netting might not be enough. You might, because bats can squeeze a lot smaller than a lot of the birds can. So I want to say that, a 2-inch mesh will not keep bats out, but it'll keep some birds out. I don't even think it'll keep all birds out.
No. When I'm talking a mesh, I'm talking maybe quarter inch at the most for your
Yeah,
openings.
that should do it. Yeah. But like when you're looking at netting, I guess they're two different things. The mesh is more metal, but if you're using netting, just make sure you got the right stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to take a little tangent here. Bats are flying mice, right? And so if you had, I know they're not exactly, but
Well, I'm not arguing with you.
if you know a mouse can fit through a hole the size of a dime, then you know a bat can fit through a hole the size of a dime as well. And so when you're, go up in your attic, look around, find those openings, go up during the day so you can see that bright light shining through, and get some of that expandable foam and fill it up. Keep them out. Once they're in, you do have to allow them an opportunity to escape. And so they put flaps on them so that they can push their way out, but they can't push their way back in. And so there are things that you can do once the animals are in your attic to get them out. But you do have to be careful because some birds are protected, and you need to know what the bird is before you're trying to forcibly evict them from your home. So do make sure you've properly identified the bird. You can send a picture of the bird to your local extension agent and be like, hey, what kind of bird is this? But do try to make sure it's a clear picture, because sometimes the pictures we get aren't really helpful.
Yeah, and whether it's protected or not, exclusion is typically going to be a good solution.
Yes.
I mean,
yes,
you're
indeed.
basically you're not killing it. You're just preventing it from coming around your area. So with exclusion, another thing you can do, if you can't put up netting, if you can't put up screens, spikes are another option. So if you have a perch point that is a nuisance to you, a nuisance to just the way it sits, and you really can't get netting around it because it's a perch point, like it's up high, you can put spikes up there, and the spikes will do the same thing.
Yeah, and you see a lot of those on stores and stuff like that.
Yeah, so like rafters, sometimes they just line them with spikes, but I don't know. Netting just kind of seems to be a good way to go for just excluding it in the rafters. But different scenarios, there's different solutions to everything.
Yeah, and I want to take this opportunity to plug one of the resources we're using today. It's from the University of Nebraska Extension Service, and it's called Urban Pest Birds Controlling Damage. It's by Stephen Van Tassel, Scott Higginstrom, and Dennis Ferraro. Is a great publication, and it's Urban Pest Birds Controlling Damage from the University of Nebraska Extension. And so we thank them for putting together a great publication.
All right, so let's just keep on moving on here. Now, frightening is kind of the more active way to keep birds away. It could be an audible, visual. You can do it with decoys. Have you ever seen those owls that people put them? That's why they put them there. Or like falcons and hawks. Just predatory birds is a visual fright to a lot of these birds that we're talking about, specifically sparrows, starlings, and pigeons in this case. And noise as well. I mean, you walk out there, you make a noise, and birds kind of scatter. You see that with pigeons, right? Mm-hmm. You hear a boom or something happens, and they just kind of fly away. Well, that works. However, birds do get used to things, just like deer, just like we do, right?
Right. Yeah. If that giant eye never causes a problem, where it's always in the same place. If you don't move it around frequently, or if it's not in a place where an owl would typically perch, birds aren't dumb, and they can figure things out. So if they know that owl has never moved, and it's sitting on a picnic table instead of up high on a perch where it can see the area, they're going to figure out that that's not really a problem, and they don't need to worry about it. So you do need to move things around, mix things up, try putting some Mylar tape out, and then, switch it up with some eye balloons, and then switch it up with an owl. Keep them on their toes, or on their wings, hopefully.
So if the noise comes at the same time every day, kind of vary that a little bit, change the noise. So it is something that you have to actively do all the time. Move the decoy around. Like pyrotechnics, I guess, is another way to do it, but there's obviously limitations on that.
Yeah, especially in an urban environment. Those noise control devices really piss off your neighbors.
Yeah, and speaking of noise devices, that the ultrasonic stuff that people plug in, they say works for mice. There's really not a lot of evidence that it works for birds or mice.
Just a standard light, like if you have like a strobe light or something like that, those have not been shown to be effective. So it does need to be randomized.
But the idea here is randomization and just kind of keep it fresh so that it's scary. Another type of repellent is tactile repellent, so sticky gels. Probably great for areas that have some kind of weather protection, areas that you don't grab, that you don't walk on, because you don't want to make a mess of things either. So, you got a beam on top of your barn that you never get to, but you like to park under. There's a roof there. Put some tactile repellent, some sticky gels in there and stuff like that. They don't like that either. Might be a little bit easier than spikes. Probably not as permanent.
Yeah.
But, it could be just a quick, easy solution.
Yeah, and some of the chemical repellents that are out there aren't necessarily able to be used on edible foods, so you do have to be careful with that. They did find there was a study in blueberries done up at Cornell where they put just simple sugar, so just, monosaccharide sugars, and they put them on blueberries when they were turning blue, and then every time it rained, they put more on, and that actually helped to reduce the damage by 50%. The downside of that was, of course, if you're spreading sugar on something, you're going to get yellow jackets. And also they had an increase of Japanese beetles. But for their blueberry crop, birds were the biggest pest. And so, they just dissolved sugar in water, and they also mixed it in with a spreader sticker. And,
you kind of have to be careful with that because, some would argue that if you increase the insect density, you're going to bring in more birds, right? Birds eat insects, and if the food's there, they're going to go there. I don't know about wasps, though. They might be a little too mean.
Yeah, I don't know many birds that eat yellow jackets. I mean, skunks think they're pretty tasty, but I don't know too many birds that eat them. But you do have the potential of increasing sooty mildew or sooty mold, right? Because you have that sucralose on the leaves, and it goes downhill from there.
Then you got other problems, right? Yeah, and also you might not have a good crop, depending on where you're spraying it, and if it gets moldy. It's, I guess, I don't know. Everything has its limitations, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Now, kind of going into the toxicants for nuisance birds. One is called starlicide. That's the registered name, but it was kind of developed with starling problems, mainly in barns and things like that. Basically, it's a bait. It's a poisonous bait. The bird eats it. A few days later, it dies. And that's kind of when Karen was talking about a lot of these birds are they kind of establish themselves in an area and they don't go away very easily. A lot of times,
and starlings are invasive.
A lot of times, this is a good way to kind of get them out of there by killing them, I guess, in this scenario. But you got to be very careful because, even though we're talking about these nuisance birds, there are protected birds. So you really have to just make sure that you pre-bait to see what comes there, and then you're not noticing any non-target birds, and then you bait, and then you have to make sure that the starlings are actually eating it, and then you use the starlicide over there, so the poisonous bait to kill the targeted species. Things. And
you do have to have a pesticide license to do this.
Oh, that's,
it's okay. This is one of those things where, you have to check with your state regulations on whether or not it's allowable in your state. This was from Nebraska, and so they do allow it, but you do have to have a pesticide license to utilize it.
So it's a restricted use product, so you're going to have to get a license for that. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and, there's a good reason for that, though.
Absolutely. But with any restricted use product, you need a license. So, some things you need them, sometimes you don't, but you always have to follow the label, right?
Yes, always follow the label. Label is the law.
Yeah, whether it's restricted or not, that label stands pretty much the same as far as the law goes.
And so when you have active nests in your barn or in your house, and you know that they are house sparrows or pigeons or starlings that are invasive species, those nests, eggs, and young are not protected by federal law. So you can disturb those nests and remove them. But if you are not positive that it is one of these species and you are not positive that it's not one of our native species, then you should be really, really careful, because you can't disturb an active nest site of a native species, even if it's Canada geese.
Right. Yeah, and that's the example I was going to give. Even though it's kind of a pest, it's still protected, and it's illegal to destroy the eggs because it has to do with the Migratory Act.
Well, I'm going to take you back a minute there, because depending in certain situations, you can damage the eggs. You can oil the eggs, which will cause that. And this is for a population of geese that is not migratory. They have stayed in your area and they're not migrating. And so if they have their nests in your farm pond or whatever, then you can oil those eggs to keep them from hatching. You don't want to remove the eggs or damage the eggs, because then they're just going to lay more. You want them to sit on those eggs as long as possible, but prevent them from hatching. And so for that control, you can do that if it is an established population that is not migratory. The migrating ones are still protected. You cannot harm the adults because you can't be positive, but you can mess with the eggs.
Yeah, and there's specific situations. So contact the wildlife officer if you have questions about that. You might need to get permission.
Indeed, yeah.
So don't go making that call without more information. So contact your wildlife officer.
Again, state laws vary, and you gotta make sure that you are following all guidelines, state and federal.
That's right. So, but if you're sure that it's not a protected species, egg and nest removal are an option. So just keep that in mind. And the best way to know is just to observe.
Yeah, indeed. Just to review, exclusion is the most effective, but it's also the most pain in the butt and expensive option. And so it may not work for you, especially if you are a fruit producer and you've got a large scale, using some of those other scare tactics, but keeping them mixed up is really going to be important for their effectiveness. So exclusion, scare tactics, and at the last resort, contact your wildlife management organization and ask for, or your extension office, and get some more help from them. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.